Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 31, Out of Sight, Out of Mind. We begin this week as 1951 draws to a close. Over the last 6 months, the battle lines of the war have not changed much, with United Nations Command wresting control of just a few square miles of territory from the Communists. The main battle was no longer fought in the hills and fields of Korea, although I'm not saying that to diminish those that fought and died on those hills and fields. The main battle of the Korean War had transitioned to the tents of Panmunjom, the small village in central Korea about 30 miles north of Seoul and 90 miles south of Pyongyang. Since October of 1950, Panmunjom had grown with tents galore, all full of United Nations and Communist negotiators and liaisons. When we last left those 10 negotiators, 5 from each side, they had split themselves into 2 subcommittees, each charged with hashing out their differences on just one point. A previous subcommittee had reached an agreement on the location of the line of demarcation between the 2 Koreas at the end of November, but their self-imposed deadline for a full ceasefire agreement passed at the end of December with no further progress made. These 2 current subcommittees were tasked with finding agreements on a ceasefire and on prisoners of war. The issue of prisoners of war was a particularly sticky wicket. Although the Geneva Convention of 1949 had prescribed a set of rules concerning the treatment of POWs, the United States had not yet ratified the convention and North Korea was not a party to the convention at all. Despite this, they still generally agreed to the provisions of the convention. The provision of the convention regarding prisoner repatriation, the act of returning POWs to the nation for which they fought, was strengthened in 1949 after the experiences of some POWs after World War II. What was once a presumption of compulsory repatriation, simply because the alternatives were not considered, was solidified with stricter language requiring quick and compulsory repatriation of all POWs. This put the negotiators in a bit of a bind because of the differences in how each side handled their POWs throughout the course of the war. On one side, UN Command had a conundrum on their hands. The population of their prisoner camps was split into 7 groups: Chinese and Korean Communist soldiers, Chinese nationalist soldiers who were incorporated into the People's Liberation Army during the Chinese Civil War, Southern volunteers that joined the Korea People's Army, Southern non-volunteers forced to serve in the KPA, ROKA soldiers forced to serve in the KPA after their capture by the KPA, ROKA soldiers mistakenly taken prisoner by UN Command soldiers while in what Walter Hermes calls a straggler status, and civilians that joined POW marches or were otherwise mistakenly placed in the POW internment system. One part of the issue is that you could never really be 100% sure that a person was in just one of these groups. Another part is that if UN Command were to repatriate all of these people to North Korea, a great many people would be ripped further from their established lives in South Korea. With that in mind, some of that last group were transferred to local custody to reintegrate them into South Korean society. That's also why, in the middle of 1951, there were serious discussions within the Joint Chiefs of Staff about the merits and demerits of voluntary and compulsory repatriation. The main point of contention was that, simply, some of the prisoners in the UN POW camps just did not want to return to either North Korea or China. There were a couple reasons given for this, like those of the Chinese nationalists that were impressed into service in the PLA, or Southern non-volunteers impressed into service in the KPA in the early months of the war. Some POWs also had, I think, a genuine fear that they would face punishment upon their return because they chose to surrender instead of dying on the battlefield. At first, a loophole was claimed by some at the U.S. Department of Defense to allow repatriation of all Chinese nationalists to Taiwan without any discussion of the matter at Panmunjom because, technically, it was still a part of China and would not constitute a strict violation of the Convention of 1949. By the time the issue of POWs came to the negotiating table in late 1951, though, this idea was pretty well dropped for something that is common in negotiations. One plan for what UN Command wanted, and another plan for what UN Command would accept. What UN Command wanted was for a one-to-one repatriation plan that would allow the UN to send back any prisoner that wasn't a danger to their interests, that wasn't at risk of death or greater injury, that wanted to go back in the first place, and that was actually from the place to which they would be sent back. If that couldn't happen, though, UN Command would accept an all-for-all repatriation agreement, with all POWs, except for those already released to the custody of local officials, mostly because they were South Korean anyway, with all POWs returned to their country in exchange for all POWs held by the Communists. As Hermes writes in his official history of this part of the Korean War, quote, "The principle of voluntary repatriation was in a strange position when the subcommittee opened its discussion, neither in nor out of planning, a desirable objective that should be attained, but with little confidence if or how it could be won, with no overriding reason for adhering to it in the event that Communists balked or showed a disposition to withhold UN Command prisoners in retaliation." End quote. The Communist negotiators were a bit less complicated in their behind-the-scenes discussions on the issue of POW repatriation. From the beginning, all-for-all repatriation was the goal, as anything less would repudiate the supposed superiority of communism over capitalism. For Mao, the issue of POW repatriation had two parts. One, he did not want the PVA to lose many soldiers, and two, he did not want the People's Republic to appear weak internationally if a large proportion of prisoners chose non-repatriation. Those two things drove the communist mindset for POWs through the negotiations. That said, Mao did not realize just how much of a sticking point this would turn out to be. In conversations with Stalin, Mao stated his expectation that these issues would not delay negotiations too long. In the same breath, he'd also told Stalin of his belief that there was a conspiracy afoot in the United States to end negotiations without an agreement. If that occurred, the KPA and PVA needed continuous resupply and reinforcement. Stalin agreed to continue to supply both armies at the existing levels, and he trusted Mao's judgment on the issue of POWs. The subcommittee discussion about POWs opened, I think, pretty straightforwardly, with U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Ruthven Libby and U.S. Army Colonel George Hickman meeting with KPA Major General Lee Sang-cho and PVA Colonel Tsai Cheng-wen. Both Libby and Lee were delegation members. Hickman and Tsai were capable members of their delegation's liaison staffs. Lee spoke first, stating that the details could be ironed out quickly, so long as everyone agreed that their agreement would release all POWs quickly at the implementation of an armistice. Libby just ignored that proposal for the time being and requested a complete and current list of POWs held by the Communists, as per his orders to avoid substantive discussion without that list. Lee and Libby went back and forth the rest of the day, with Libby later reporting to Ridgway that the Communists were most likely to want an all-for-all exchange. This back and forth about the Communists' lack of honesty about the total number of POWs they had and UN Command's repeated request for Red Cross visits continued through December 1951. As Hermes puts quite humorously, quote, "Both sides seemed eager to take the other to the cleaners. The big problem was to settle which one would be cleaned." End quote. As each side submitted and resubmitted lists of prisoners, the Communists took umbrage with the fact that the United Nations released 37,000 POWs in 1951 after reclassifying them as civilian internees mistakenly picked up in wider sweeps of the countryside. UN Command took umbrage with the discrepancies between the list the Communists provided, which had about 12,000 names of ROK and UN personnel captured, and what the Communists said they captured in radio broadcasts and in newspapers, which was roundabouts between 65,000 and 80,000. These were separate issues, but were intertwined in the discussion and would remain as much. Lee protested that to reclassify POWs as civilian internees was the incorrect action to take because what mattered was the army in which a man fought, not his place of birth. That argument didn't go far with Libby, who rebutted that the KPA and PVA self-reported tens of thousands of POWs at one point, but now just claimed a small portion of that. How then could the UN trust anything their opponent said? To Libby, Lee had no satisfactory response for this, except to say that many ROKA soldiers they captured volunteered to fight for the KPA. This was in fact part of a widespread impressment campaign that grew the KPA while decreasing the stresses of guarding large POW camps. But it also provided the UN negotiators with an opening. Libby proposed 3 areas of disagreement for their subcommittee to solve. 1. Their differences in how POWs would be released, whether all for all or a more equitable ratio based on the differences in total POWs held. 2. The matter of those ROKA soldiers forced into KPA service. And 3. The standard for which POW status would be determined, either by place of residency or army of service. Libby pressed that because the KPA allowed captured ROKA soldiers to volunteer for KPA service, they had accepted that POWs have a certain amount of free will after their release, and to stay consistent with that principle, all POWs should be allowed to choose their fate after their release. This argument for voluntary repatriation was a smart move in negotiations, and was a potential propaganda victory for UN Command, but was rejected quickly by the Communists as absurd and not worthy of discussion, and didn't really make it any further after that. Libby also pointed out that the Chinese soldiers in Korea were volunteers, and was curious as to why the Communist negotiators thought there would be some who would not want to return home. Lee shot back that the UN's proposal was essentially a slave trade, to which Libby responded, quote, "Your analysis is faulty, your arguments are specious, and your conclusions are wrong. Outside of that, it was a nice piece of work." End quote. Needless to say, progress was still out of reach for the time being. This argument about voluntary repatriation was not coming out of the blue. It was rooted in a fundamental disagreement about the 1949 revision to the Third Geneva Convention. The Communists stood firm that the Third Convention required repatriation of all POWs, while UN Command believed the Sixth Article of the Convention left open the possibility for voluntary repatriation through a special agreement, so long as that agreement did not deprive POWs of their rights under the Convention. Again, none of the involved parties with delegates present at the negotiations had yet ratified the convention in question, but it provided an anchoring point, both for negotiations and for public perception of the negotiations. That battle for positive public perception drove Ridgway to refuse to unilaterally release a large number of reclassified POWs. This was suggested by some officials of the Department of Defense directly to Ridgway as a way to tie the hands of the Communists on voluntary repatriation. Ridgway did not want to lose the trust the UN delegation had built up to this point, and preferred to offer a package deal by trading airfield rehabilitation, which we talked about last episode, for voluntary repatriation. Ridgway was interested in the potential of a package deal by mid-January because the Subcommittee on Item 3, the ceasefire agreement, had not yet reached an agreement on that issue. There were 3 main points of disagreement: the matter of airfields, the matter of rotation and replenishment, and the matter of the neutral observer teams. C.F. Fang offered the first olive branch in this subcommittee, offering to drop the Communists' objections to personnel rotation and replenishment if UN Command dropped their objections to airfield rehabilitation and construction. After a few days of ignoring that offer, UN Command offered to refrain from any aerial observations after the ceasefire if the Communists accepted restrictions on airfield rehabilitation. CA liked the idea of no aerial observation, but did not like the idea of restricted airfield activities. This softened UN stance came from desires in Washington to 1. Get some movement towards an armistice agreement, 2. Allow a post-armistice sanctions declaration to do some of the heavy lifting in the propaganda realm, and 3. Limit the future necessity of restarting the war after that Armistice agreement was signed. There were serious questions about how the United States specifically could even enforce any restrictions on airfield rehabilitation and construction if the North Koreans decided to just ignore them. This was an unpopular war back home, and there was no real desire among political leadership to jump back into it once it was over. That's why, on January 10th, Ridgway received word that he was to abandon the UN position on restricting airfield rehabilitation and construction if it alone stood in the way of an armistice agreement. Around the same time, CA submitted a proposal that dropped communist objections to personnel replacement and replenishment, so long as there was no increase in personnel or equipment. The area of dispute was slowly shrinking, bit by little bit. On January 27th, the ceasefire subcommittee subdelegated its negotiations to staff officers and recessed, hoping those of lower rank could iron out the details. The first motion on Item 5, that of recommendations to the governments of both sides, came a few days after the ceasefire subcommittee recessed. Nam-il first proposed that 5 delegates from each side would meet within 3 months of an armistice to discuss political topics, including withdrawal of foreign troops from the Korean Peninsula, a peaceful settlement to the conflict, and any other problems related to peace between the two Koreas. UN Command generally agreed with these and submitted a counterproposal that was essentially the same, but with enough differences in language that the two sides argued over whose was better for the next week. Finally, on February 17th, the two sides reached an agreement that recommended a political conference 3 months after the signing of the Armistice Agreement to discuss the withdrawal of all foreign, non-Korean military forces from Korea and the peaceful settlement of the Korean question in general. This took just 11 days, but that's mostly because this agreement did not really say anything at all. It did not tie anyone to anything, or require anything of anyone. Nevertheless, things were slowly improving in Panmunjom. The staff officers began their discussions on Item 3 immediately. The representatives for UN Command brought a draft armistice that covered the same issues raised by their superiors, except they swapped the airfield matter for the matter of coastal islands. If you look at the Korean coastline, there's a great deal of small islands along the western and southern coasts. UN forces maintained control of most of these islands as the war ran up and down the peninsula, and the question now became what to do with those islands, particularly those controlled by the UN north of the main battle line. Most importantly for each of these subcommittee understudies, everyone in the room was decidedly less concerned about bloviating or blustering. Real progress was made quickly with the communist representatives mostly accepting UN proposed language and points and adding constructive improvements that were quickly accepted by UN representatives. Like everything else in this tent city, though, things hit a snag. This time, the snag was over the number of personnel that could be rotated in and out of Korea and the number of ports through which they could move. The UN representatives started at 75,000 each, through 12 northern ports and 10 southern ports, while the communist representatives proposed 5,000 each through 3 ports each. Over the next few weeks, these numbers slowly came together, with a final agreement reached for 35,000 troops through 5 ports each. This was agreed upon by swapping one last lowering of the number of ports desired by the UN representatives for the communist representatives dropping their request for full rights and freedoms for the observer inspection teams. This was a rapid switch in the communist position on the matter, having previously argued for restrictions on those teams that made Ridgway question if there were any ulterior motives at play here. Of course, there were ulterior motives, as there always are. Maybe the communists wanted a peek at some fancy American equipment? But this was pretty clearly just a negotiating tactic by the communists because they dropped that request quickly to reach agreement on personnel replacement on March 15th. Their next topic for discussion was the matter of coastal islands. the Communist representatives did not challenge the UN claim to 5 disputed island groups on the west coast, about which the UN representatives really expected more of a discussion. What they did end up discussing was where to set the limit for coastal waters, with the UN preferring a 3-mile limit and the Communists preferring a 12-mile limit. This difference was because the UN held a vast naval advantage over the Communists, controlling most all of the waters around Korea. This coastal waters limit would set the outer limit for territorial waters, which would define things like exclusive economic zones, areas of fishing rights, things along those lines. A line further out would limit naval effectiveness for their enemy, so the Communists wanted the line out as far as they could place it. For the UN, well, specifically the United States, they just did not want to set any international precedents by accepting a 12-mile limit in Korea. To keep discussion moving, both sides just kind of let that matter go for now. The final issue on the table, that of the makeup of the observer teams, quickly became troublesome. As per an earlier agreed definition, the teams would be comprised of representatives from neutral nations that had not participated in combat in Korea. The UN proposed Sweden, Switzerland, and Norway. The Communists proposed Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. The first 2 of those were just fine with the Americans, but the Soviets presented a problem. By this point, UN Command knew pretty well that Soviet pilots had flown over Korea and strongly suspected that the Soviets were supplying both the KPA and the PVA with arms, equipment, and advice. That was enough to make the Americans weary of allowing them a neutral place in the Armistice Agreement, notwithstanding the general state of the Cold War between the 2 powers at the time. The UN representatives rejected the Soviets and offered to drop Norway if the Soviets were also dropped as an option, which was rejected by the Communists. The Americans offered to accept the Soviets on the body if they themselves were allowed to join as one of the UN nations and the neutral designations removed entirely, which their opponents also refused. The neutral part was really important to the Chinese and North Koreans because it kept the United States out. So again, negotiations dragged to a halt. Given the gridlock at Panmunjom, Admiral Joy presented Ridgway with what he thought were 2 decent options, an ultimatum and an ultimatum with a time limit. Now these wouldn't just be any old ultimatum, these were considered by Joy to be the UN's last best hope at reaching peace through negotiations in a reasonable time. Joy's first choice, actually the ultimatum with a time limit, would have the delegates present a full armistice agreement based off all the discussions up to this point, with a time limit for communist acceptance. If that time limit expired, full hostilities would resume and the negotiations called off. The second option, which Joy felt did not have as strong an incentive as the first option, was essentially the same without the time limit. In both, minor changes could be made, but major changes would not. Ridgway disagreed with Joy and directed him that neither option should be taken. They would stay the course. This was all part of a delicate balancing game Ridgway had to play as a moderating influence to the delegates in Panmunjom and an aggressive, action-oriented theater commander to those back in Washington. To his subordinates, he had to temper their wilder tendencies. To his superiors, he had to push them towards more decisive action. That balancing act was tested when, just after Ridgway rejected Joy's proposal, the Joint Chiefs sent him a worse proposal. They wanted Joy and company to iron out as many issues as they could. Then, once an impasse was inevitably reached, Ridgway would request a meeting with Kim Il-sung and Peng Dehuai. At that meeting, Ridgway would propose a full package deal with the understanding that it was an all-or-nothing, take-it-or-leave-it ultimatum. Ridgway disagreed with just about every part of the plan, from the administrative aspects, like the meeting with Kim and Peng, to the substantive aspects, including a difference in the number of expected concessions included for each side. Now, while this had the trappings of an ultimatum, it was not intended to be one. Just as before, no one back in Washington really wanted to take the actions that would be necessary to back up their threat of breaking off negotiations. They wanted the rewards of an ultimatum without the risks of an ultimatum. In the meantime, the ceasefire subcommittee concluded the work of their staff officers at the beginning of April and reconvened to confirm the agreements therefrom. After those officers spent 9 weeks debating and discussing those issues, only two major ones remained: that of the airfield and that of the Soviet Union. So the generals again dug into the meat of the matter, sometimes taking up to 15 seconds to meet. Yes, on April 14th, just 15 seconds separated the opening of the meeting and the closing of the meeting. It seems that the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. By mid-March, everyone really wanted to make some waves on the POW matter. Still, the issue precluding agreement was UN Command's desire for voluntary repatriation and Communist Command's desire for compulsory repatriation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff thought that a concealed census of all POWs held by UN Command in Korea would enable a more fruitful discussion in Panmunjom, but Ridgway was adamant that such trickery would not go unnoticed or unpunished by the Communists at the negotiating table. Instead, he had one of the liaison staff officers suggest that they were unwilling to form a rough estimate of POWs eligible for repatriation, after which the communist officer across the table suggested both sides complete a census of POWs anyway to ease future discussion. For UN Command, this census would be final and binding, meaning no other census would be undertaken and whoever asked to not go home would not be able to change their mind later. In the hopes of limiting those that wanted to not go home, the Chinese provided UN Command with a statement that declared amnesty for all those captured during the course of the war. The statement was promulgated throughout the camps, and the census began on April 8th. Each prisoner was asked 7 questions, all about whether or not they wanted to return home, if they would use violence to fight returning home, and if they understood that non-repatriates had an uncertain future at best. There were no major incidences of violence, and the entire screening process more or less went smoothly. Sort of. About 37,000 North Korean POWs did not want to undergo the screening process, so they refused. And then verbal fights broke out between the POWs and South Korean guards. Then someone threw some rocks, and more rocks were thrown. Then someone fired their gun, and more guards fired their guns. At that one camp, 7 POWs were killed, and 65 more were in some way injured. Despite that opposition, with about 65,000 screened in the first 3 days, about 40,000 said they would violently resist returning to North Korea or China. This was a big problem because UN Command only had about 132,000 POWs, and they had just told the communists in Panmunjom that they thought they would repatriate 116,000 POWs. The numbers were just not adding up, even if every single one of the POWs not yet screened chose repatriation. In total, after 170,000 interviews and screenings of both POW and civilian internees in UN camps, only 70,000 would accept repatriation without resistance. That was a lot lower than what was previously suggested. Anticipating the communist negotiators taking issue with this difference, Ridgway directed Joy liaison staff to propose that the Red Cross rescreen all expected non-repatriates. If they refused that, then a package deal would have to be presented to try to tie up all the loose ends by swapping this issue for that concession, generally speaking. When the Chinese liaison staff heard this number, they requested an immediate recess after a brief bout of speechlessness. When they returned the next morning, the communists refused to accept such a preposterously low number. Furthermore, because screening had been such a disaster for the communists, rescreening was wiped from the table entirely. The only way forward for now would be with a package deal. That deal had no mention of airfields, established a neutral nations observation body with Switzerland, Sweden, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, and required repatriation of the 70,000 screened POWs from the UN for an expected 12,000 from the Communists. UN Command presented this deal on April 28th, and NAM rejected it even more quickly than it was presented. Hermes writes that it, quote, created as much stir as a pebble dropped in the ocean, end quote. This was a poor ultimatum in everything but name, with no threat to back it up and little reason for the Communists to accept the deal. As you may remember from last episode, Ridgway had no desire to make any major changes to the current battle lines across Korea. Both his and James Van Fleet's staff developed plans for large offensives, but Ridgway consistently nixed these, largely because he did not want to rock the boat so much that the negotiations fell apart. That's why, in November of 1951, Ridgway instructed Van Fleet's 8th Army to undertake an active defense that would only capture the best defensible territory in their sectors through actions no larger than that of a division. Other than that, only small actions, like patrolling or maintaining outposts, were allowed. This was evidence of a wider sentiment both in Ridgway's staff in Tokyo as well as in the relevant offices back in Washington that, so long as negotiations were ongoing, major offensives by UN command were off the table. No one on the UN side that mattered wanted their side to be the reason that negotiations fell apart. They wanted to put that onus on the Communists as much as they could. While the negotiators battled things out in the truce tent, smaller skirmishes were consistently fought over the individual hills of Korea. Hills captured one day were lost the next, then recaptured the day after that. This pattern continued throughout the winter as each side wanted to capture the best defensible ground to give themselves a leg up on the post-Armistice frontier. For the most part, the winter of 1951-1952 passed considerably calmer than the winter of 1950-1951. The first months of 1952 contained very little combat for the men in Korea, on both sides of the fighting. What small skirmishes that did occur were almost always instigated by patrols of one side or the other getting a bit too close to the enemy. And there were no major battles until summer had well settled onto the peninsula. Battles that were fought on comparatively small pieces of land that provided an immediate advantage over the enemy in that single sector, or were fought to capture a handful of prisoners that could provide information that, at the edges of believable hope, would illuminate the coming plans of the enemy and provide a path to victory for their side. There is much that can be said about American POWs in Korea, particularly because there is much, in my opinion, that has not been said about American POWs in Korea. These men, and they are, I believe, entirely men, were caught between the Americans taken prisoner during World War II, who were held captive under very different circumstances, and the comparatively few Americans taken prisoner in Vietnam, with veterans of that war facing a wholly different experience upon their return home. That, coupled with the Korean War's general middle child status in America's 21st century wars, has placed American POWs in Korea in a weird historical position. Because there were so many more taken prisoner during World War II, no one seemed to particularly care about those taken prisoner in Korea by the time they made it home. Domestic politics also were not kind to those returnees. There used to be a painfully and dangerously common misconception about these prisoners that they had been brainwashed by their North Korean and Chinese captors to act as communist plants in the United States upon their return. You can see this in stories like The Manchurian Candidate, where a Korean War POW is brainwashed into assassinating various political figures in the US. This is, of course, a bunch of baloney, but such apocryphal stories had a real impact on the prisoners that returned. A lot were stuck with the stigma that they were soft, had given in to the enemy, and had betrayed their fellow soldiers when really they were placed in immensely difficult situations in which most normal people would struggle to survive. The conditions of non-Korean POWs held by the Communists is best broken up into two periods of time: the dynamic period and the static period. These periods line up with the earlier offensive phase of the war and the defensive phase of the war we are discussing now. During the dynamic period, prisoners were continuously on the move in freezing conditions and were severely underfed and undercared for, meaning diseases were rampant and could tear through groups of prisoners like wildfire. Prisoners injured before or during their capture rarely received medical care, and those that did often received immensely poor medical care due to a lack of medication, equipment, or trained doctors. Prisoners captured before the landings at Incheon and the rapid UN advance northward were forced into long marches in increasingly treacherous circumstances once that advance reached the Yalu. One such march is now known as the Tiger Death March, so named for its main overseer, known only by his nickname, the Tiger. This was a death march in every sense of the word, with prisoners forced to walk nearly 60 miles through freezing weather and difficult terrain over the course of 9 days in early November 1950. Prisoners that could not keep up with the rapid pace of the march were beaten until they did keep up, and those that fell behind were executed. Of the 845 prisoners that started on the march, approximately 100 died during the march, and a further 450 died over the next 12 months, likely due to the effects of the march, largely caused by the immense physical and mental strain the march placed on the prisoners and their bodies. If you'd like a fuller accounting of the march and of the American POW experience during the war, I highly recommend Lewis Carlson's Remembered Prisoners of a Forgotten War, an oral history drawing on the experiences of prisoners that covers the entire war, including their experiences once home. Once the war slowed to a crawl near the 38th parallel, conditions improved markedly for POWs north of the front line. Of course, this was just an improvement relative to the constant motion required of them by their captors during the dynamic phase and the harsh winter of 1950-1951. Once permanent camps were constructed and more Chinese administrators were imported to manage those camps, prisoners became slightly better fed, slightly more cared for, and were generally more likely to survive. Most of those permanent camps were just small villages commandeered by the KPA and PVA to house prisoners, with some prisoners even living with Korean families charged with their safekeeping. In many of the stories Carlson writes about, POWs that survived the war separate their fellow prisoners into 4 groups: the regular guys just trying to make it home, the reactionaries who were really anti-communist, the progressives who wanted to make it home but weren't against communism, and the rats, who would do anything to make their time in the camps as comfortable as possible. No one, not even the progressives, seemed to like the rats. These were the guys who would lie and cheat and steal from their fellow prisoners if it meant better treatment by the Chinese and North Koreans. Most of the prisoners hated the rats and would express their displeasure if given the opportunity. For the reactionaries and regular guys, beatings administered by the guards were the common response to any insolence or insubordination, especially related to the education sessions prisoners were sometimes forced to attend. When beatings were not the response, it was less a sign that the indoctrination finally took hold, and more because the prisoners had annoyed their captors into giving up for the time being. These indoctrination sessions were just the opposite of what was being done to Korean and Chinese prisoners held in the South, trying to teach the imperialists the benefits of communism over capitalism. Any supply issue faced by the KPA and PVA meant that the prisoners would go hungry more often than not. Sorghum and barley were the most common meal in the camps, with meals often only provided once a day, which made life even more difficult for those prisoners used to eating much more at home. Lastly, and this is more a neat little story I find interesting than anything really important, some Turkish prisoners taught those Americans that were with them and that were interested how to find, harvest, and utilize some of the wild plants that grew around their camps, like, for example, marijuana. A few of the POWs Carlson writes about cite marijuana as a key coping mechanism for them, given the lack of smoking tobacco and the lack of other sources of recreation. It brought prisoners together and allowed them to show another small act of defiance towards their captors, especially in the camps where escape was impossible. And for the most part, escape was impossible. It was just too far from the front lines, over terrain that was too difficult to manage, with too many people in between them. That's why if a prisoner did escape, it was almost always very quickly after their initial capture. Quite frankly, there is an unfortunate dearth of material about the experiences of South Korean soldiers taken prisoner during the war. Officially, 8,000 South Koreans were captured compared to just under 5,000 Americans, around 1,000 Brits, and a comparative handful from other UN allies, not to minimize the experiences of any of those POWs. However, it is known by most reasonable sources that many more South Koreans were captured by the KPA and PVA and remained in North Korean custody long after the signing of the Armistice in 1953. The governments of North Korea and China have never confirmed this, of course. That number could be as high as 60,000, which is drawn from the difference between the North Koreans' early claims to have captured 70,000 ROKA soldiers and their final submission of just 8,000 names for repatriation. What likely happened to the 60,000 POWs who were not repatriated was that they were forced into slave labor in North Korea, or they were forced into service in the KPA. I don't have any numbers to put to that, but accounts of those relative few, only 70 or so men, who have returned to South Korea show that this did happen. Again, we just don't know how widespread it was, or frankly, still is. Those men that were captured during the war had front row seats to the changes in North Korean society after the war's end, something we'll discuss more as we end this series. But they are an important and overlooked part of the POW puzzle just because there were so many of them, and so few of their stories have been told. They faced, like their American counterparts, horrendous conditions that were made significantly worse by their Koreanness. North Korean captors were not fond of extending any sympathy or comfort to the men they often deemed imperialist dogs. In one article I found on the topic from Radio Free Asia, which is admittedly a US government news agency, returned POWs and their children are quoted as saying that the North Koreans never treated them as human, that they were forced into work North Koreans did not want to do themselves, and that their quality of life was always significantly lower than the already decreasing quality of life experienced by most North Koreans as time went on. Again, none of that has been, or probably ever will be, officially acknowledged by the North Korean government, so take all of this with the requisite infinitesimally small grain of salt. But quite honestly, I think obfuscating the number of prisoners captured and kept is perfectly in line with everything else we now know about North Korea. Please feel free to disagree with me on that, and ultimately, always make up your own mind for yourself. By the time the weather warmed in Korea in 1952, things were particularly precarious in UN Command's prisoner of war camps. Hermes traces these issues back to the very first months of the war, citing the rapid increase in the number of POWs held from about 1,000 in August to around 130,000 in November. That's a lot of people, and there just wasn't space for them at the time. All the POW infrastructure was put together as needed on an ad hoc basis. That lack of infrastructure was further compounded by a lack of guards to guard the camps. And that lack of guards was further compounded by the presence of former ROKA soldiers impressed into service with the KPA, who, after their second capture, drastically exacerbated communist and anti-communist tensions in the camps. I'm not blaming tensions on those captured soldiers, because it takes two to tango. I'm just saying their presence amplified the intercompound conflicts between different ideological groups. So, what we get by the first half of 1952 is a situation where there are camps hastily put together, holding many more prisoners than they probably should, guarded by far too few UN personnel, largely under the control of the prisoners in the camps. These places were veritable tinderboxes. They just needed the right spark at the right time. This situation might have been manageable if camps were spread out across South Korea, if large groups of prisoners were kept generally separate from each other. UN Command thought it would be best, though, to move all POWs to one place to more easily imprison them. The place chosen for this was Kojido, an island about 30 miles southwest of Busan. And it wasn't a terrible idea. Camp administration would be easier with all POWs in one place, and it did lower the overall number of guards a bit. The actual execution of the idea was not great. The first camps built were far too small, designed to only hold around 1,000 prisoners, but holding between 4,000 and 5,000 prisoners in reality. A lack of fresh water also became a consistent and costly problem for prisoners, locals, refugees, and UN personnel alike. Once those small compounds filled up, UN Command began to fill in the spaces in between them with POWs. Besides water scarcity, the two big issues early on were the proximity between prisoners, allowing a free exchange of plans and the like between camps, and the proximity between prisoners and ROKA guards, two groups that, understandably, weren't big fans of each other. Fights, both verbal and physical, were common in camps. These tensions were also inflamed by the presence of communist, infiltrators is the best word, probably. Basically, North Korean and Chinese agents that would go to the front with the purpose of being captured so they could lead POW groups in the camps. Those communist POW groups would fight anti-communist POW groups made up of former ROKA soldiers, nationalist Chinese soldiers, and KPA soldiers whose education did not properly take hold. Opposing groups would kidnap and beat their opponents, and prison justice became the norm, precluding camp administration from enacting any control through punishment. UN Command also instituted a re-education program to show the POWs the positives of capitalism and the negatives of communism. These were voluntary classes, but communists both at Kojido and at Panmunjom protested vociferously nonetheless. The violence boiled over in February when a battalion of ROKA soldiers attempted to enter one camp, Compound 62, to screen 5,600 prisoners to determine their official status for repatriation. The leaders of this camp refused, and the ROKA moved in the next morning. The soldiers were met with prisoners wielding whatever weapons they could find, be them rocks, tent poles, pickaxes, etc. The soldiers threw concussion grenades, to no avail, and a hail of gunfire ripped through the crowd. The guards killed 77 prisoners by the end of the day, and the soldiers pulled back from the camp without screening any of the prisoners. The prisoners won. To limit the impact of the incident on the negotiations at Panmunjom, UN Command declared that just 1,500 prisoners took part in the riot, and in fact, these rioters were not prisoners at all. They were civilian internees, placing them outside of the purview of the discussions at Panmunjom and outside of the concern of the communists. Van Fleet ordered Brigadier General Francis Dodd to Kojido to take command of the island and institute control over the camps and those within its barbed wire fences. About a month after Dodd's arrival, Van Fleet ordered the removal of all anti-communist POWs from Kojido, swelling the ranks of the communists in the island's camps with new prisoners while simultaneously freeing up a good chunk of their time that previously went to intercompound conflict. By the end of April, 17 compounds were fully controlled by the communists within. Everyone was in a bit of a sticky situation at the beginning of May then, with, as Hermes writes, UN Command unable to enter the camps without violence, and the prisoners unable to leave the camps without violence. Only 10 of those 17 camps were previously screened for repatriation, so Van Fleet made it a priority of the Guard Regiment to screen the remaining 7, until Ridgway reminded him that screening was not a priority, but keeping control of the situation was. For now, an unsteady stalemate would have to suffice. That stalemate was shattered on May 7th. Prisoners of one of the communist compounds, number 76, requested a meeting with Dodd to discuss the issues that kept them from consenting to screening. To ensure Dodd showed up, the prisoners mentioned that, maybe they would be open to that screening if they could just meet with the good general. In the afternoon of the 7th, Dodd arrived outside the camp, as he had done many times before, with an assisting colonel. The 2 Americans stood before the prisoners with just an unlocked gate between them. Gates in these camps were often left unlocked to allow easier access for work details and because simply, if anyone tried to escape through an unlocked gate, they would be shot, no questions asked. So Dodd and his colonel, Colonel Raven, are standing there talking with this group of prisoners when a work detail exited the compound, taking some old tents out, leaving the gate open between the prisoners and the general. Acting quickly, the prisoners grabbed the general and swept him into the camp. Colonel Raven was only saved by his quick thinking and sure grip of one of the fence posts, which was probably strengthened by the recent memories of his own kidnapping by the prisoners. Raven was secured by guards at bayonet point, and a flag was raised over Compound 76. It relayed that Dodd was safe so long as their demands were met and no violence happened against them. Van Fleet received word of Dodd's doom from the acting commandant of the camp. He replied that force was strictly prohibited unless ordered by his word alone. Dodd either took it upon himself to act as the messenger between his superiors and his captors, or accepted his captors' offer to be the messenger between them and his superiors. Either way, he spoke with Colonel William Craig, his interim replacement, over a telephone provided by UN Command and informed the colonel that he agreed with Van Fleet on the matter of an armed rescue attempt. Representatives from the other communist compounds were gathered at number 76 and their demands were discussed. Those demands were then given to Dodd the next morning. They were mostly about easing communication between the compounds with telephones and vehicles for traveling between the compounds. Dodd agreed, although he couldn't actually make any agreements, and the representatives of the other communist compounds decided to return to their compounds to discuss the demands with those they represented. Craig refused to allow this until Van Fleet ordered him to do so that afternoon. Meanwhile, a battalion of machine gun crews transited to Kojido from Busan on a ship stuffed with grenades and gas masks. UN Air Forces flew overwatch of the island, and ROK Navy ships established a perimeter around the island if the prisoners attempted a mass escape. Craig was relieved by I Corps' Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Charles Colson, on May 8th, and preparations were made to rescue Dodd by force, if necessary. Dodd, naturally, was not a fan of that idea, mostly because, he was surrounded by guys that had no qualms about killing him very quickly and very painfully if it came to that. But he did not have the authority to stop any of the decisions made by those outside the fence. Colson ordered the prisoners to release Dodd on the morning of the 9th, which they of course refused, instead inviting him to a meeting, just like the one they invited Dodd to 48 hours earlier. Colson refused the meeting, but couldn't do much in the way of forcefully freeing Dodd until an armored battalion arrived later that evening. Plans were set in motion upon their arrival that would have an armed rescue operation begin at 10 a.m. on May 10th, if the prisoners did not comply and release Dodd. While waiting for the expected fatal blow from UN Command, the prisoners held a trial for their dear camp commandant. They made the American imperialist dog answer for 19 charges of death and injury to POWs held on Kojido, each of which Dodd responded to as requested. Imagine that, an American general put on trial by the prisoners he oversaw surrounded by the guards he so recently led. What a sight. This trial was pretty slow, given all the translating that needed to be done, which was nice that the communists were kind enough to let Dodd understand that of which they accused him and his men. This trial was part of the communists' plan to delay the expected rescue operation. Nonetheless, Coulson declined to dislocate his deadline for the dynamic dispersion of the disobedient detainees' disrespectful disposition of dear Doyen Dodd during his distressing detainment. This was supported by Van Fleet, Ridgway, and Ridgway's named but not yet installed successor, General Mark Clark, who's probably best known for his time in Italy during World War II. When Dodd and Coulson spoke on the evening of the 9th, both men expected it to be the last time they would hear each other's voices. The sun rose over Kojido on the 10th as rain drenched the island and its inhabitants, both willing and unwilling. The last of the prisoner's demands arrived on Coulson's desk a few hours before his planned operation. It stated the POW's desire to stop all alleged barbarous and illegal behavior, their words, not mine, of UN command, including voluntary repatriation, crimes against POWs as defined by the Geneva Convention, and screening. The POWs would release Dodd safely if UN command met these demands, but UN command could never do that. To agree to those demands would be to admit that the screenings were illegal, calling into question the screenings already completed. Coulson ran the matter up the chain of command and received permission to drop nominal screening for the remaining camps, and packaging this with his recognition of the POW's original demand for a POW association to better communicate future issues with camp command, delayed the planned rescue operation and attempted to negotiate with those he held captive. The prisoners refused this offer, and refused to release Dodd, and the stalemate continued as the two parties negotiated through translators. Finally, an agreement was reached that had Coulson admitting that some unfortunate instances of violence had occurred between guards and prisoners, stating that repatriation was outside of his purview given its discussion at Panmunjom, agreeing to end forced screening of those compounds that did not want it, and recognizing a POW Association of Representatives. The detained detainers decided to hold Dodd overnight to better allow for a proper release ceremony, complete with a necklace of flowers for their detainee. Recognizing Coulson's anger at this further annoyance, and also the 20 tanks that appeared outside of their compound throughout the day, the men of Compound 76 decided against holding Dodd any longer, and released him at 9:30 p.m. on May 10th. Dodd's release is not the end of this story simply because it proved that the prisoners had power, real power, in the Kojido camps. Furthermore, they knew that they could exercise this power, not necessarily by capturing a high-ranking officer, but by matching threats of mass violence with UN Command's desire to end the disturbances in the camps without bloodshed, as that would cause trouble at Panmunjom. There were also concerns that violently ending the Dodd affair would push the Chinese and North Koreans to harm UN prisoners in their prison camps. Because a rescue by force was not undertaken, we don't know for sure if doing so would really have instigated compensatory reprisals from the communists against their prisoners, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. After Dodd's release, now Supreme Commander Clark demoted both Dodd and Coulson to colonel, and reprimanded them for actions that, as a board of review chaired by Clark would conclude, gave the communists at Panmunjom a clear propaganda victory. Neither Dodd nor Coulson were made aware of this board of review until after its conclusion. Dodd retired from the army within a year and died 20 years later. His rank was not restored until 1977. Coulson transferred to command the military district of Washington, where he was again raised to the rank of brigadier general before retiring, like Dodd, in 1953. Only when Dodd's rank was restored did Van Fleet finally say, clearly with the benefit of hindsight, that Dodd and Coulson's actions during this affair were the proper actions. In the immediate aftermath, though, he argued for reprimand and administrative actions. That was because Coulson's letter to the prisoners securing Dodd's release did create a bit of a kerfuffle, mostly in the press. They made a big stink about the whole matter, which was partially because that's their job, but partially also because UN Command tried to keep its press corps on a tight leash in Korea. The relationship between war reporters and those on whom they are reporting is always a tricky one. Especially for the American reporters in Korea, there was a fine line they had to walk personally and professionally between getting the answers they needed and their sense of patriotism, whatever that meant to them. Press officers and other higher ups were, in my opinion, overly stingy with information and often catered to those really gung ho reporters that just wanted to wave the flag for the folks back home. They had, for the most part, very real reasons for doing this, as everyone knew that whatever ended up in the papers or on the airwaves would certainly be read and heard in Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow. That's why there's a very narrow balance that must be had between what information can be released to inform the public, what information should be released to sway world opinion, and what information would hurt the war effort if erroneously released. Everyone at UN Command now knew something needed to be done to get all the compounds at Kojido back under control. The new camp commandant, American Brigadier General Hayden Boatner, put into motion a new operation to construct smaller compounds, move the remaining civilians on the island off the island, and move the offending prisoners into the new compounds. Without the fear of death for a general, Boatner had no qualms using force to pacify the compounds in question. Well, force short of outright shooting prisoners. Bayonets, tear gas, and concussion grenades were all utilized as American soldiers moved through the compounds, freeing those prisoners that were taken prisoner by their fellow prisoners for being anti-communist, and moving those ardent communists into the new compounds. Resistance was broken by the presence of tanks, those same ones from the Dot Affair, that had hung around afterwards to make things easier for the guards of Kojido. UN Command pulled thousands of weapons out of each of these compounds cleared on June 10th, with spears fashioned from tent poles, knives fashioned from anything, and somehow gasoline grenades. The ingenuity of the prisoners once left to their own devices is kind of impressive. After compound number 76 was cleared, the remaining communist camps complied with Boatner's orders to move to the new compounds pretty quickly. All in all, the Dot Affair and its aftermath is a good example of the experience of many of the prisoners of war captured by UN Command during the war. Those that were captured but were not communist or were not soldiers were largely placed back into the population of South Korea. Those that were captured and were communists largely had a great deal of freedom within their compounds. They could not leave, and they could not move freely between compounds, but they mostly did what they wanted within those fences. Even the American attempts to educate them on the benefits of capitalism over communism were often in vain, with many compounds refusing to allow such classes to take place. Orders from Pyongyang were also passed efficiently through the military hierarchy, with those agents that allowed themselves to be captured transmitting messages to the camps. Messages would then return via a network of civilians and guerrillas north to the communist line. And that's why Boatner removed civilians from Kojido, to limit the communists' ability to get messages back to their people and potentially sway the progress at Panmunjom. Back at Panmunjom, Joy had proposed the package deal at the end of April that was promptly rejected by Nam as unreasonable. Joy's time at Panmunjom was coming to a close anyway, and on May 22nd he was replaced by Major General William Harrison, who had earlier joined the delegation and simply moved up to Chief Delegate for UN Command. Other changes occurred within the UN delegation, but there was no substantive change in the UN position or tactics at Panmunjom. Because there was also no substantive change in the communist position or tactics, the status quo held through the end of May and June. Delegates would meet briefly, then recess for 3 or 4 days, meet again, recess again. Meanwhile, tensions lessened at Kojido because of both Coulson's promises and, well, the tanks, allowing UN Command to complete its screening of all 170,000 prisoners and internees in their care. A final, for now, report, completed in late June, counted 81,000 repatriates and 89,000 non-repatriates. About 56% of POWs were North Korean, 12% were Chinese, 10% were South Korean, and 21% were civilian internees. 2/3 of North Koreans and just 1/3 of Chinese prisoners chose repatriation. A quarter of South Koreans and civilians detained chose repatriation as well, which is both a little unsurprising and a little surprising. Unsurprising because, well, these people probably wanted to stay near their homes, in South Korea. And surprising because that number is higher than I think I would expect, but also I'm not entirely sure what number I did expect out of those. As June drew to a close, Harrison announced at Panmunjom that UN Command was releasing the 27,000 or so civilians they held that chose to stay in South Korea. Harrison justified this as a solely internal matter and simply ignored the communist complaints. Thus, the first half of 1952 ended without an armistice agreement. The war would go on. Before we end today, I want to spend a minute talking about our pal Kim Il-sung. In January of 1952, unlike in 1951, Kim actually seemed to want a quick truce with his imperialist enemy. This changing desire most likely arose from the first traces we can see of the cult of Kim that would totally consume North Korean society after the end of the war and would, eventually, turn what could have been a semi-prosperous communist state in the vein of China or Vietnam into the hermit kingdom we know and love today. This cult began with a fracture between Kim and Pak Han-yong and Ho Kei-ai. All three had different visions of a communist future of Korea, but unlike them, Kim had a fervent base of support within the highest echelons of the North Korean state. This fracture manifested itself first in Ho's expulsion from the Korean Workers' Party in late 1951, and then Kim's closing of the Kumgang Political Institute in March of 1952. The KPI was a pet project of Pak, who wanted to use KPI trainees to infiltrate South Korea, train and lead guerrillas, and generally disrupt their enemy from the inside. Pak responded with an official birthday message that simultaneously celebrated Kim's 40th birthday and placed Kim quite clearly below Stalin in the communist hierarchy, which makes sense generally speaking, but was untenable for those in Kim's orbit that were becoming increasingly more fervent in their worship of the middle-aged Kim. This would not pay immediate dividends for Pak, but it was one of the first steps in the slow, dramatic turning of Kim Il-sung into a true lone despot. Kim's attitude towards an armistice agreement was further changed by the mid-1952 UN bombing campaigns against Pyongyang and various North Korean hydroelectric plants. On June 23rd, the U.S. Air Force and Navy bombed 13 hydroelectric plants, including the massive Suiho Dam on the Yalu River. This operation was a wild success in the sense that it plunged North Korea into a blackout for a fortnight. Operation Pressure Pump resumed about 2 weeks later, with American planes dropping a reported 23,000 gallons of napalm on Pyongyang. Throughout July, the Americans bombed more industrial facilities, crippling the North Korean economy in critical ways, like limiting the amount of concrete and steel produced. Mao took these setbacks in stride, asking Stalin for continued allotments of military equipment. Kim, however, was severely disturbed by these bombing campaigns, reportedly proposing an immediate acceptance of U.S. terms on POWs to Mao. Mao responded negatively to this idea, stating that to accept the American terms as a result of the bombings would be, quote-unquote, extremely disadvantageous. He flat-out refused to accept the present American position on POW repatriation and did not want the communists, maybe more specifically his East Asian communists, to show any weakness to the imperialists. Thus, Kim decided as well that a truce at this time was disadvantageous, and he urged his countrymen to fight on. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, marking the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War. Next week, We will discuss the American presidential election of 1952, the continuing negotiations at Panmunjom, combat along the main line of contact, and how both sides built and maintained coalitions in Korea. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you are not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information like the references for today's episode at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We should release new episodes every Tuesday. These next 4 episodes up to the end of the series will be more regular, I promise. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.